Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be having an informational session about you can read strategic approaches to achieving diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials. My name is Ken Rooney, and I'll be the facilitator for today. As I mentioned, the program is being recorded. Please submit your questions or comments via chat. As you can see, we've already been doing a little bit of chatting. It's one CPE credit is available for this session, and to get that CPE credit, you need to be here for the duration of the program and answer at least 3 of the polling questions. There's 4 of them, so answer at least 3 of them during this conversation, and then we'll email you the CPE certificate in a couple weeks. And then there'll also be a survey that we'd like you to complete just to give us feedback, not only on this webinar, other webinars you'd like to see in the future. So with that said, I'd like to turn it over to Marcia and to have her introduce herself, as well as she'll introduce LaShell, and we'll go from here. Marcia?
Awesome. Thank you, Kenan, DJ Rooney. So appreciate that. Who doesn't love Prince? Welcome to everybody. We're looking forward to having a really engaging session where we're talking, of course, about strategic approaches to achieving diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials. I'm Marcia Brown-Rayford, and I'm the Vice President and head of our global life sciences practice with a focus in R&D. So anything from development through to commercialization falls under my purview. Been with the organization for 4 years, and actually in this role for the last year and a leg. Super excited about future opportunities and what we're working on. Just a little bit about my background. I cut my teeth in life sciences. Started out with Bristol Myers Products as a 17-year-old kid, and have been doing the same ever since. Got my first job with Merck in their research labs in drug development, and also in scale-up tech transfer, basically providing the compounds for clinical trials. Went off to PricewaterhouseCoopers in their life sciences practice, playing with wonderful companies and doing some cool things, I hope, and then went back to Merck as an internal consultant to those very scientists that I was working along with on the bench. And so tried to teach them some business principles and develop some really cool things together. Stuff happened. Now I'm at RGP. One other thing of note, RGP has a DE&I council that I sit on. So we're super excited about that. So we can bring some things from various lenses here, and super excited and enthused to dive into the topic of interest today. And without further ado, would love to introduce our wonderful guest panelist, LaShell Robinson of Takeda Pharmaceuticals. And LaShell, we'll hand the mic over to you to introduce yourself, and then we're going to dive into the topics at hand.
Absolutely. First and foremost, thank you, of course, for having me, especially on a topic I'm extremely personally passionate about. I mean, obviously, I'm supporting the larger efforts for Takeda Pharmaceutical, but for me, my journey started much before that. I think I shared very early on when Marcia and I met that this is what I thought I hoped and dreamed of doing when I thought of my career. A little bit, about me is I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah, and that really set a lot of my life trajectory, being, one of first African-Americans in my family to do a lot of firsts. We were one of the first families to integrate our neighborhoods and schools, et cetera. And so looking at that DE&I inclusion, it's really been part of that fabric of my life. And a lot of my family members have done that. But I have a passion for science. I love data. I love 1 + 1 always equals 2. And for me, it takes the subjective and makes it objective. And it's a way that I've always approached that to really gain better understanding. So with that, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. That was the way I really wanted to make that impact, and went to Tuskegee University, where I majored in biology. But I think, like a lot of us, we have those life-changing events that really change what you think you want to do. And for me, it was my sister simply having migraines and suffering from migraines for 8 years of her life, and watching just kind of the detrimental impact that had. But more importantly, the lack of treatment options. I remember the very last time I took her to the hospital, the physician said to me that there were no other treatment options. And if I really wanted to do something, then I would have to enroll her in a clinical trial. And it really hit me like a ton of bricks, because I said to myself, if I become a physician, I could be in that exact same situation where I'm not really providing any treatments or pathways. And so how do I get in front of that process? How do I start being part of that innovation? How do I start being part of that research? And ironically, with me being at Tuskegee, those things just serendipitously happened. So I picked up physics and decided I wanted to do biomedical engineering, and got my biomedical engineering degree with a specific focus in clinical research development, and began my pathway of getting into industry. Some of that included working at a site and learning what it was like to be to consent patients and work with people in the community, so I could hear those different challenges. Because for me, Tuskegee was very, very real. I mean, going to school on that campus, I had the ironic experience of having Booker T. Washington found that school, George Washington Carver being such a renowned scientist, and then this looming unethical aspect that has really changed the trajectory of what it's like for African Americans, not only in healthcare, but their perception of clinical research. And so I'm just very excited to be part of that pathway. Awesome. Before I was at Takeda, I was at J&J, where I helped with the COVID-19 vaccine trials in a very same capacity. And before that, I also helped with work streams like a lot of us that are contributing to DE&I. So just very happy to be here today and share some of the strategic approaches on how we can really live into this.
Super fantastic. So folks, we have someone super capable to discuss the topic at hand. We're cousins. I'm chemical engineering and LaShell was biomedical engineering. And so, so we're here to just kind of share from our lenses and also from the standpoint of the industry, right? And when we say life sciences at RGP, we mean pharma, biotech, and med device, right? So these principles apply across life sciences and even other ecosystems. So for the sake of our conversation today, if you saw the invite, we wanted to stay true to the invite. We didn't want to list topics that we would cover and then you get in the session and it's like, okay, why are we talking basket weaving 101? We're staying true to what we said that we would cover and what we would discuss. This is a topic so important to our industry, and we'll get into why. But first of all, we're going to talk about decentralized clinical trials. And you probably have heard that term. And what does it mean? There are various definitions that you'll hear depending on who's in the conversation. We want to kind of talk about that, as well as strategies to build trust and support community engagement. That's super important. Impact, what does technology and digital have to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials and bringing more people into the space to ensure that they have access? How can technology actually help? Does regulatory have a role, right? Let's specifically point out the FDA, right? Does the FDA have a role and other regulatory agencies? Let's talk about that, as well as now let's look at the bottom line, right? In terms of the financial impact of a lack of diversity, a lack of equity, and a lack of inclusion in clinical trials. There is a bottom line impact, right? And there's a top line advantage to doing so. And we'll get into some of those elements, as well as how can we measure our success, right? What are some of those KPIs or key performance indicators that we can leverage and walk away from today's conversation with to be able to see how we can measure our performance and our effectiveness in DE&I, specifically in clinical trials. Next slide, please. So, okay, let's level set with some terminology, right? Our taxonomy here in terms of what do we mean by diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I gave you a preamble and I warned you in advance that I do sit on RGP's DE&I Council. I don't say that with a sense of being an enforcer or anything like that. I'm saying it with the sense of like coming out with my hands up and admitting that I heavily leveraged and borrowed these definitions that our DE&I Council developed, right, with respect to our own working environment. And so it was done with a bit of research. So I'm going to read these shamelessly because that's what we want to do to make sure we're level setting on what we're talking about today, so that we're talking apples to apples and not apples to tangerines. And then I'm going to ask LaShell to just kind of weigh in from a clinical trials or clinical research perspective. But by diversity, this is what we mean. It includes, but is not limited to, race, color, ethnicity, nationality, religion, socioeconomic status, veteran status, education, marital status, language, age, gender, gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation, mental or physical ability, and learning styles. So diversity is not just based on race, right? Not just based on skin color or ethnicity. All of these parameters and dimensions are what are included in what makes up and constitutes diversity, right? So that means we've got a broad swath, right, that we can leverage as a net to cast to determine whether or not we're operating with respect to diversity in clinical trials and other areas of operations. Equity, what do we mean by equity? The guarantee of fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all while striving to identify and eliminate barriers. Remember that, barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. So that's what's meant by equity. And then inclusion, the definition we're leveraging for inclusion is the fair and respectful treatment of all individuals, providing equal access to opportunities, resources, and the possibility to contribute, right, of space at the table fully to successful outcomes. Okay, so those are our working definitions, heavily borrowed and probably stolen from RGP, the RGP DE&I Council. And so I'll just throw the ball to you, LaShell, with respect to our definitions and some of the things we can think about as we dive into talking about DE&I in clinical trials.
Absolutely. So of course, diversity includes all those different aspects. And I know over the last 2 years in particular, there's been a hyper focus when it comes to race and ethnicity and even age, which we saw with the pandemic. But even another factor to think about is comorbidities, right? Some of the different aspects that we look at in the new development process is, aside from gender and ethnicity, what are those comorbidities that we have to include in research? Because once it gets in the real world population, it must work. So in addition to those, we're looking at those different factors, and we want to make sure that our trials truly reflect the diversity of the patients that are going to be impacted by that disease. From an equity standpoint, fair and just treatment. Admittedly, from a sponsor perspective, we tend to go to the same sites and same locations over and over. And as we start looking at the data, you'll see the result of that. And so how can we broaden that to really ensure that we're providing equitable access to any person from any diversity? So socioeconomics rise. Are we only concentrating our trial execution in metro areas? What does that mean for a rural population? And how do we start seeing those gaps present themselves? So again, making sure that everyone has that equitable access regardless of where they are at. And then lastly, inclusion. And from this standpoint, if I raise my hand and I want to participate in a trial, or I'm willing to, I should have that inclusive opportunity to do that. And the physician or the investigator should not necessarily be making that decision for me before I've had that opportunity. And we do know that at times we have that unconscious bias that we see from our investigative sites, and even the way we develop the protocol that really limit that inclusive behavior. So when we're looking at it from a DE&I aspect in clinical trials, those are areas that we see as opportunities to make sure that we're doing better at that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's think about this. Just a quick example. There was a clinical trial that was underway, and they were actually enrolling for this clinical trial. And there was a physician that did not inform one of his patients about this clinical trial because she was a mother. He just made that assumption because she's a mother and has children, then her participation, she would be prohibited from participating in the clinical trial, and never even gave her the opportunity to participate because she was a woman and because she had children, right? Okay, next slide, please, Kenneth. We're going to get into some of these details. So what are decentralized clinical trials? And I'm gonna throw the ball over to LaShell to just kind of help us to understand what are decentralized clinical trials. There's so many definitions out there, but from the standpoint of best practices and what's common across the industry, what constitutes a decentralized clinical trial?
Well, we really started to see this term really bubble up during, again, the pandemic, where we were really forced to a lot of remote and hybrids type situations, and in full cases, fully remote. But at its core, it's really the aspect of trying to make sure that all of the clinical trial aspects are taking place in different locations. So it can be anything from wearables that are very common, heart trackers, measurements around walking, pedometers that automatically record data, to having a traveling nurse that actually visits your home or your work to do lab draws, or even perform the physical assessment for trial entry. On the digital side, we see electronic informed consent. Telemedicine is what we really saw a peak in during the pandemic. But all of those different aspects that really look at bringing the trial closer to the patient and making it more accessible are those different elements. I know a lot of times we really hone in on the digital aspects, but there are those humanization aspects too that make it a little bit better. And really what we're looking at doing is trying to remove some of the logistical barriers that people typically encounter, and it prevents them from participating in a clinical trial. Just like we mentioned about the mother that was not afforded that opportunity. And I've heard that story over and over again as well. But thinking about that differently, extending the office hours for our typical clinical trial participation beyond that 9 to 5, and using some of the resources actually in the community to help execute the trial.
Excellent, excellent. So okay, yeah, there seems to be this tendency to believe that decentralized clinical trials are actually less costly, right? Less cumbersome, more efficient, just by waving a magic wand and be thou decentralized, and the world is this wonderful magical place and the heavens open, and angels sing. Can you speak to that? Are they less costly, and are they less cumbersome? How should we think about that?
So there are advantages. The things that I think we need to always keep in mind is, before we start ingraining every single technology into that actual protocol, who are the end users and who are our sites? And so when we see those two things disconnected, we see things like more costly programs, or now we've added another application that our clinical sites are now required to learn. Does that speed up the trial? Well, not necessarily, if the site is having those cumbersome challenges of needing to do more training. And now again, we've added another aspect to that. On the other hand, it can speed up the way that we aggregate our data and can be a benefit. So from a cost standpoint, it can help. But if we don't take the proper time to do that pressure testing before the onset, or even poll the communities and patients, I have seen it where it has actually escalated some of those costs, because we're not doing that proactive planning, and we're just saying, wow, technology is great, we need to incorporate it, let's move forward.
Absolutely. No, that's super helpful. And just to, for our audience here to be thinking about those, technology platforms, adding another platform, another portal, and then those platforms not being conversant, it can
Right, that
absolutely
lack of integration. That's
Absolutely.
really where we get a lot of feedback from sites. Is it integrated? And then they just, again, see it as another task they have to do. I mean, admittedly, even with the patient recruitment standpoint, having a website and another portal to access patients can be a little bit of a barrier. So again, I think it has the opportunity to be cost savings, but we really have to stop and look at the trial design, look at the end user of the patient, and ask our sites before we move forward. And in that manner, it can be cost effective.
Absolutely. Yeah. So taking a surgical lens when thinking about decentralized clinical trials. So with that, next slide in the poll.
Hi, everybody. Your first polling question, it should be on the screen right now. Launch. Decentralized clinical trials are proven to be less costly and more seamless than traditional centralized trials. True or false?
And play the Jeopardy music.
Exactly. Sorry, I don't know.
No. It's playing in my head.
Exactly. A couple more people in the
Awesome.
It's kind of an interesting thing here. I'm going to actually stop the poll because it's been wavering at this. It's a 50-50. So I don't know if people are quite clear on that response, because I just heard the response, but I'm wondering why.
Okay. Yeah. So let's read the question again. Decentralized clinical trials are proven to be absolutely less costly, right? And more seamless than traditional centralized trials. They're proven to be absolutely, I just added that word, right? Less costly and more seamless. Can we re-administer the poll, or one and done?
No, I think it's one. Actually, I don't know. Let's try.
Let's try it and see. Do a retest.
No, I don't think I can.
Okay. Well, how about you put in the chat? Is this true or false?
There we go. Look at this relaunch poll. There we go, everybody.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay. Second chance. Second chance.
Yeah, there we go.
How are we looking, Kenan?
Better.
Okay, we're better. Well, let's give the answer. The answer is that's false, right? It's not true. There are some benefits, right? But you have to work those benefits. You have to ensure that implementing decentralized clinical trials, that's where a lot of sponsor companies, life sciences companies, pharma companies end up encountering challenges and cost escalation because of, let's say, for instance, just assuming that it's more seamless and it's less costly but anytime you're shifting your operations, there's an impact. And so we have to ensure that we're thinking about the sites themselves, the technology that we're leveraging, that it is patient focused. And sometimes to be more patient centric is going to require additional investment, right? So we just want to make sure that that message resonated and was a key take home for us.
LaShell, I just wanted to talk about something real quick. I spent a lot of time on the health of the provider side and the whole term interoperability of systems, right? And LaShell, you just brought that up too. Interoperability can't get to the data because it's not talking to each other. No one can pull at it. So my question to you in a clinical trial, and I don't know if there's a precise answer to this, who's responsible? Who's taking care of the interoperability of that data from that side? I understand it from the provider side where you have an IT department doing all that, but what's happening from a clinical trials perspective for that data to be interconnected, interwoven? Where does that come into place?
Right. So, I mean, on the operations side for sure. And it really would depend on if that is an in-source trial, that means a trial where the sponsor is taking control of all those different aspects, or when it's outsourced and we're on that reliance of vendors to make those two things. And sometimes even that model is where those challenges ingrained. We've contracted with a certain vendor and they have a certain platform. And then on the other side, the CRO has a different platform, and the two just don't speak to each other. And, we're a very, very timeline driven organization. So it's always, how can we get the first patient in? How can we start enrolling patients? How can we get the last patient in and rush to market? And sometimes we don't take that due diligence to try to do a little pressure testing to make sure that there's that interconnectivity. And to your point, it can be a real issue.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Kenan. Okay. So we're talking about decentralized clinical trials. We're talking those trials taking place in the communities where your target demographics actually reside. But I think we need to take a step either back, aside, or just pause for a second and talk about how do we engage with those communities and how do we build trust with those communities so that they actually engage and we can penetrate them with the possibility and the opportunity of clinical trials. So LaShell, this is a really key point, right? Because before we get started and start moving forward with planning and building and all the possibilities, history has brought us, to a certain point, right? History determines where we are now, and where we are now is going to predict where we're going. Can you kind of speak to how we can build that trust and what history has played in the space in terms of the lack thereof, if you will?
So, I mean, I'll start with being an alum of Tuskegee. For me, that experience is very, very real. And I think for a lot of people in the Black community, that experience is a real aspect. My dad talks about being in high school and when that story broke on TV and how that changed his perception of healthcare, and how even me participating in clinical research as an employee, as a contributor on the sponsor side, has helped rebuild that trust. But not everyone has that advantage, right? And so sometimes, especially when I very, very first started doing the DE&I discussions, and before the pandemic really hit, there's sometimes a lack of understanding. Like, that happened a long time ago. Tuskegee was a long time ago. And really, that's the only source of an ethics that a lot of people hone on to. And so when we're seeing that mistrust in other populations, like the Latinx population, the Asian population, the indigenous population, it starts to make you think, were there other aspects that contributed to that? And so from that point moving forward, I have always started off my trainings by really trying to level set. Again, I said I'm a big data person, but history is also part of that story and helps tell the data. And so if you go to the next slide, you can really see, I usually title it The History of Modern Clinical Research. And by no means is this all inclusive and extensive of some of these events. But aside from the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which took place over that 40-year period where we had 600 men, I mean, even looking at that title, Untreated Syphilis, you can tell that the intent was really to study how syphilis manifested in that particular population, even though they knew in 1947 that penicillin was a cure. We see the Guatemala study of sexually transmitted diseases, overlapping right with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And again, that goal was the same thing. Pretty much these prisoners were actually injected with different sexually transmitted diseases for the sole purpose of seeing a difference in disease manifestation. Then we're moving over to the birth control experiment or birth control trials. This is something that took place in Puerto Rico. And I always like to think about that time in particular, because in 1955, That's really when women didn't have a lot of reproductive options when it came to how to control having families, right? They were relying on natural family planning. And so this thought process was to have a pill to control that. But the conductors and the persons that made the birth control pill specifically went to the US territory of Puerto Rico. And I like to point this out because oftentimes you think of Puerto Rico as another country, but it is US territory. So we're talking about people who are part of the US. And they actually have a consortium of clinics. And ironically, in Puerto Rico, these particular clinics performed abortions. They performed sterilizations during this 1950s times. So it was a real trusted environment within the community. And that's exactly where they chose to execute this particular trial. So these women never knew that they were in a trial. They were told that that particular medication was approved. And it wasn't until 1964 when they actually saw it put forth for FDA approval that they learned they were actually in a clinical trial. And the list goes on, but you see the other aspects here, even lasting up to 1994. So when we take a step back and when you look at this history, you can understand why there's a little skepticism around clinical research and the amount of work, quite frankly, that needs to be done with the community, in partnership with the community, to start addressing some of those myths and, quite frankly, reestablishing trust.
Mm-hmm. Now that's super helpful. That is super helpful. So you've got the Tuskegee study, right, on untreated syphilis, and oftentimes we think that people really know about that. That went over 40 years, right? Over 40 years and uninterrupted. And so as a result, what has been a result of some of these events that have taken place in various parts of the world, as we can see? What's been the result in terms of an international or global response?
So for the most part, these in particular all took place in the US. And so we saw the birth of more informed consent guidance. In particular with the indigenous population, there's actually a very special consenting process above normal informed consent that needs to be done. In addition to that, when we're looking at the way that our trials are conducted, that contract, that informed consent is required, and also the ability to withdraw your participation. With Henrietta Lacks, we're seeing the evolution of her cells being taken and being used without her permission, and how that's changed the biospecimen aspect. So globally, there's a lot of conversation around, can you use biospecimens for future use? How do you get a patient's consent? And what do you need to share with the patient? What's the patient's comfortability? So these are all discussions that are really going on in real time as we're speaking, because people are becoming more curious and want to contribute to science, but they also want to have some barriers or some guardrails in place that protect their privacy because of these situations that have happened. So those are just some of the regulatory impacts that we see now as a result of some of this historic aspects or unethical events.
No, that's perfect. So now that we've laid the foundation there in terms of the history, we can go to the next slide. So, let's talk about where the stats lie right now. And I'll just keep the ball in your court. LaShell, I have another question for you as we go, but go ahead and just take it away here in terms of, clinical trials and the need to reflect the real world population. And as we talk about that, how can we overcome some of these, barriers of skepticism and lack of participation based on that history, right? I'll give the ball into your court right now to just take it and run with it.
Yeah, real quick, we're at the bottom of the hour, just so you know. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
First and foremost, this is just kind of an overview. We know that the FDA, aside from just this last year, has really always said that we should proactively try to include patients that are reflective of the disease. Why is that? We know that there are diseases, there are medications that impact people differently based on genetic makeup. We see differences between males and females around the way they metabolize medications, the way it works from a safety and efficacy standpoint, and even that side effect profile. On the right-hand side, I've even highlighted some some diseases that you may be familiar with when it comes to those disparities. So lupus, higher impact in women right there, but in particular, women of color. For COVID-19, we saw the elderly population or over 65 population, people with comorbidities. We also saw that the indigenous population by the end of the pandemic was really at that 2.7%. So when we pair those two things together, it's not necessarily a nice to have. It's not about social justice. It really is rooted in the data. If we want to make sure that our medications, once they are approved, work in that real world population, then we have to start addressing that in our clinical trials. There's a lot of discussion around health equity, and clinical trials are that gateway, because at that very particular point, we can start seeing these different differences, and we can really start seeing how we need to study our drugs differently and if there are those differentiations. And that pretty much impacts everything moving from there.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay, next slide. Let's talk about it. We don't want to miss. Okay, let's hop into to these stats, which are actually from the FDA. So take it away.
Right. So this particular data on the left-hand side is from FDA Snapshots. And one of the efforts that the FDA made in 2014 was to do more transparency and also inform sponsors. This is what the industry is looking like in these different indications. Before that, there was really not a barometer around diversity. So every year, based on the drugs that are actually approved, they publish data around the different demographics. So for 2020, you can see that about 56% of the trials that were performed included women. But that also includes a lot of particular indications like breast cancer, cervical cancer, et cetera, where we know the population is going to be higher, and for the most part, women. 75% white. 8% African American, 6% Asian, Hispanic 11%, over 65, 30%. And while this is global data, I think it's very important to point out that 54%, or the majority of the participants, are from the US. So even though this is a global trial, you still see that this in nowhere near matches what our US demographics are. And when we start drilling down to even more specifics, oncology, I in particular put this one out because that's where we see the greatest disparities along the lines of race, ethnicity, and socioeconomics. You can see that disparity growing even further and further. And so as we start becoming a more diverse population, you'll see the US census on the right-hand side. We're going to start becoming a more diverse population. We saw that with the last results of the US Census data. And so if we don't start trying to make sure that we're being more inclusive, this gap will just get wider and wider and wider when we're looking at our health equity and also the impact on our healthcare system.
Absolutely, absolutely. So then let's pause, because I took a moment not to really lean heavier into, we see these figures, right? How do we start to build trust? What are some of the ways that you've recognized that actually work to start building trust, and getting these target demographics to just kind of lower their suspicion, right, barrier, to become more involved, because there is a financial impact to what we see on the screen, and we're going to talk about it in a couple of slides. What do you say about that, LaShell?
Education, and transparency. If there was one thing that every single major sponsor that was making a vaccine learned, it's not necessarily that people of color do not want to participate in clinical research. There would be no way that we were able to accelerate those timelines and also have a very reflective and diverse population if that willingness weren't there. So first, I would say education. People don't even really know where to search for a clinical trial. So we have to make sure, A, that our sites are in those locations and we raise that visibility. If I don't know that a clinical trial is taking place in my neighborhood, there's no way for me to even do that. The second part also too is really attaching that their medication, or most people have a family member or a friend or someone that takes a medication, if not themselves. Well, how does that process fit in? And so oftentimes when those two things are disconnected, people are very, very comfortable taking a medication that their doctor prescribed, but don't necessarily know that they weren't included. So again, I lean on education and really starting to talk to people about the connection between clinical trial innovation and their medication. And then the other part is partnering with the community. I think oftentimes we take a very, very monolithic approach, and Tuskegee's for every single Black and brown person out there, but every single community has their very, very own specific trust factors. And one of those different aspects that we see in other communities could be linguistics, simply because the physician did not speak the same language. Well, that should never be an issue of why a person can't get into a clinical trial. Has nothing to do with mistrust, has nothing to do with distrust with the investigator. It's simply because there's not a common language. And so those are some of the different factors that we can use to start building trust, but also make sure we're educating and putting those, removing those operational barriers. parameters that are very, very simple that can help open those gateways.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. So it seems that if we also ensure to have principal investigators, right, in these communities, that these communities recognize and that they trust. And, you know, if you have principal investigators that are part of those communities, then you'll have situations like language barriers that kind of go away, right? And so these are some of the things that we need to think about, right? When it comes to building trust, there are various parameters and various dimensions to think about, but it's going to take some effort and it's going to take some work to mitigate some of the trust issues that pervade, but also some of the top line revenue and bottom line benefits that there are to diversity, equity, and inclusion. All right, next slide, Kenan. This is wonderful. Were you going to say something else, LaShell?
I was going to say, you know, one simple step, I always mention partnering with the community. So one simple step that's very, very tangible is before you're actually finalizing your protocol, ask your community physicians, ask those physicians that are actually seeing the people in the community, and ask the community, not just necessarily the patients, but ask them to weigh in on those different aspects. And right there, you can actually speed up that timeline because from the very beginning, you're thinking about the patient in mind.
Absolutely. And by protocol, that means the design of your clinical trial, basically.
Exactly.
Right? How you're designing it. Yeah. Who's included, who's excluded, right? Things of that nature, and getting input from local physicians and those that would, not just input from them, but to your point, LaShell, asking those local doctors to participate in the trials and to become principal investigators. And it's going to take somewhat of maybe of an investment to help them to even prepare and get ready, right? So how much would it mean to a clinical trials patient that the ones that are administering those clinical trials are, you know, are basically implementing them and participating in them, look like them and can speak their language, and they trust, and that's Boo-Boo's cousin and things that may not be Boo-Boo, but you know what I mean. And so yeah.
Even taking that a step back, you know, I realize that not all physicians want to execute clinical trials. There's, you know, that can be a very, very daunting process, and some don't have the staff. However, exposing them the opportunity to refer their patients. I mean, things of that nature, getting really creative of how we can just get more in touch with the community. And again, incorporate people that people trust and that they see every day. And not only just at the investigative side with that diversity, but I always like to mention that they're looking at the sponsor too. They want to see people that are reflective of them also partaking in that process. I know we need to move on to this particular section. So we're looking at, what is this? Inequities, disproportionate by disease, not just general population. So I'll just dive right in. I think everybody knows somebody that has type 2 diabetes, one of the most chronic diseases or illnesses that we see in the US. And if we think about the proportion of the US from a census data, we know that the white population is actually is the majority, right? But when we're looking at the incidence of type 2 diabetes, we see the Black population, the Asian population, the Hispanic population over-indexed. But when we look at our clinical trial data, which we can go to the next slide, this is an example of one of the, I think I rushed a little bit too soon. We'll look at the data for a trial. We'll notice that there are gaps, and we'll walk through why that becomes an issue when we're looking at a drug that's made to treat a disease and the impact that that has in a real world population once it's approved.
Absolutely. All right, time for polling question.
Yes, everyone, here, let me set this off. Polling question number 2, launch.
Clinical trials patients should reflect, so clinical trials patients, those that participate in clinical trials should reflect what?
A, the doctor and nurses who conduct the research. B, the sponsor company's executives and senior leaders. C, the overall population and disease burden. And D, none of the above. Okay. I'm just going to stop that because everyone's already at 100%.
Come on, yes.
Yes.
Yes. And I can understand why the 3% said what they said as far as the doctors and nurses who conduct the research, because we talked about you know, the trial sites in the community and, you know, doctors and nurses looking like, you know, the patient population. But specifically based on, let's say, you know, epidemiology data and things like that. C. So if you chose A, you know what, you get an honorary score for that. Cool, perfect, awesome. All right, next slide.
this is where I was jumping quite ahead too, but what is the impact of not having that diverse population? And again, drug trial snapshots, one of my favorite websites to go to if I'm interested in a drug and I want to see if it actually includes me or people that look like me. And this is for type 2 diabetes. So we just saw the demographics of what it looks like typically for type 2 diabetes. And we can see in this particular clinical trial, 64% white, 32% Asian. So we did really great in enrolling the Asian population for this particular trial. And you can see here, did it work well? They can say with confidence, they can say in the labeling that it worked well in white and Asian patients. And even further that it works slightly better in Asian patients. What a good thing to be able to put on your label for a disease that is quite frankly pretty chronic. Also could state to the efficacy in over age 65. We know that a lot of type 2 diabetes patients continue to take medication even in their older ages. But what about the side effect profile? That couldn't be determined in other races or ethnicities because the population was too small. And even from how well did it work, it couldn't be determined in other populations. So when you think about that larger scale, you have a physician that's writing the script. They don't even know if the medication works for the patient that they're giving it to. And we see this over and over and over and over again. And it makes you kind of stop and pause. And when you look at that collective data, wow, that's a really, really large problem. So again, taking the data to make something that feels nice and is subjective and making it really objective so we know that this is the right thing to do from a data science perspective, because we want to, again, make sure that our drugs work in the patients that will use it.
Absolutely. And to your point, LaShell, about a prescribing physician not knowing if that drug will work, and included in that, not knowing what the side effects might be for that particular demographic. So now you're talking safety. Now you're talking, that's a little dangerous, right? That's a bit dangerous. And so keep that in mind, folks, as we move forward in these slides. Just keep these pieces in mind because it all rolls up to, what are the dollar implications here, right? Just it's an aggregate. Okay, next slide. I think there's a polling question.
Polling question number 3, launching poll. Of all approved drugs of 2020, Blacks constituted greater than 10% of clinical trial participants. True or false?
True or false? So for 2020, all the approved drugs, Blacks constituted more than 10% of the clinical trials participants. Is that true? Or is it false?
It's correct. It's false.
75% got it right. It's false. Blacks were less than 10% of all the clinical trials with respect to the drugs that were approved in 2020, less than 10%. Okay, just using Blacks as a demographic. Just using Blacks. I was going to say, not because we're Black, it's just because, it's a fact, right? And we want to leverage that as a benchmark in some cases so that we can really extrapolate and springboard to talk about other elements. So let's talk about this digital divide, right? We already mentioned some things about it, but what about this digital divide and what are some of the implications? Of course, COVID has really exacerbated and highlighted, the digital divide and telemedicine and the use of telemedicine. But can you help us there in terms of how it's impacting even being able to enhance DE&I or diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials?
Well, I think there's definitely two conversations going on. One about how this DCT and digitizing trials is really going to speed up access and inclusion. But before we start, getting in that space, we have to take a look at what happened when all the schools went down, right? And kids were forced to work at home, and some students didn't have access, and some students didn't have a computer. Some were doing their homework literally, on a digital device. Well, that's the same implications that we really see within COVID. I know me personally, right now I'm enrolled in a clinical trial, and one of the requirements was that I had a phone that was required to receive text messages and that I had to download an app, and every single week I had to answer that. Well, what if I had a visual acuity issue? That would be very, very difficult to participate in a clinical trial. What if I simply did not have a device? Obviously, there's no way for me to participate from that perspective as well. And so while we're putting these digital divides, these digital solutions in place, we want to make sure that we're also mitigating them. So if we're building a trial that requires an electronic device, are we providing it? And again, that's the importance of asking sites who their patients are, so we can provide those different devices. If we're looking at adding in a website that people are required to, or telemedicine, how does that impact people that are maybe multilingual, right? And may need those translation, those interpretive services, and how does that impact their experience? So I always say a hybrid approach, and again, taking the time to look at your clinical trial design and seeing if it's appropriate. We're finding that, oftentimes for a lot of our oncology trials, it's a little bit more difficult to incorporate some of these elements. And then for some of our other trials, they're very, very easy. For some cardiovascular studies that are looking at exercise parameters, it's very easy to get somebody to wear a digital watch or a wearable. So again, making sure we're taking an eye and saying, who are the patients? What is the goal for the technology? And is it really going to speed up? And are we creating another divide? And how can we mitigate that?
Absolutely. Can we hit the last bullet really quickly? Prioritizing and focusing on the tech savvy really further widens and broadens that divide, right? So if we focus on those that do have those smartphones and they know how to get on apps and they know how to download apps and things like that, we're kind of leaving behind those that are lower tech or no tech or what have
Absolutely.
you. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I've seen trials where it's required to have like an Apple device. So there you've cut out any population that doesn't have an Android, because we're thinking Apple is, the most optimal. And even thinking further about it, when you delve into the demographics around Apple, you have a higher socioeconomic level, you have a mostly white patient pool, you also have it slightly skewed in the male population. So again, when we start putting those things in place, you can see how it just continues to be a little more exclusive, when it was really intended to say, hey, we can now enroll people nationwide, worldwide. But you've limited your population by just limiting, that device to an Apple device. So
I have a Samsung, so I wouldn't be included.
Exactly. And it was interesting because when I was reading that, it was the first thing I said. I said, I love Google. I'm loyal to it. I've been loyal since day one. I now cannot participate in this trial. And they went, oh my gosh, I never thought about that. Mm-hmm. So again, you're focusing on, that tech savviness further widens that gap. And then, there's a call for including most of the elderly population. I mean, while we're seeing the evolution of most people having access to a device and most people being comfortable with it because, the internet's been here for quite a bit of time and all of those different aspects, it's kind of contradictory with also trying to enroll an elderly population that may not have access to those things. So again, do we want to be tech savvy for the sake of just being tech savvy, or is it actually going to contribute to the actual data at the end of the day?
No, that's really helpful. Very helpful. Okay, I know our time is getting upon us, and we're gonna close out with these last two elements. And next slide, Kenan, please. With respect to regulatory, can you just kind of speak to that a little bit? Does regulatory have a place in DE&I and clinical trial? And I understand even with respect to EUA, right, emergency use authorizations for COVID vaccines and therapeutics, diagnostics and things like that, there was a requirement, right? There was a diversity requirement. Some actually called out, let's say, African Americans, those populations that were more heavily impacted. Speak to that in terms of any kind of, the sponsor's perspective.
So from the sponsor's perspective, I mean, having that insight and coordinating with the FDA at the very, very beginning is always optimal. Just recently, we saw a non-small cell lung cancer drug that was only executed in China being declined from the FDA because of lack of diversity. Well, there was no prior engagement from the sponsor to the FDA, and now you've seen a whole drug that does not have access to the market in the UK, in the US. I mean, can you imagine the bottom line dollar implication of that when they thought they were going to go into the US market? But furthermore, that guidance around what the FDA is expecting, I've seen it go from being US Census reflective, which in some cases doesn't necessarily marry up to the disease. But now we're getting closer to getting more guidance around, okay, it really does need to reflect the patient population that will take the disease, or that will actually have the disease. They're asking questions around not just race and ethnicity, but also age, comorbidity. And then furthermore, what are you doing as a sponsor to start proactively mitigating that? So not necessarily a diversity plan, but what is your diversity strategy? And so I know from a sponsor perspective, everybody's very, very curious to see if there will be diversity plans required from the FDA moving forward. To date, for the most part, how we've really seen them regulate it is in the form of post-marketing commitments. And so essentially what that is where we submit our data to the FDA and they say, hey, this particular, drug is supposed to work in multiple myeloma, and you have 3% African-American patients. We know in real world population, that's upwards in 27%. You need to now perform another trial that says your drug works in African-Americans. So talk about bottom line, when now you have to execute a totally different trial in the African-American population, and then adding to all of those aspects of mistrust, trying to go to the African-American community. You don't have access to sites that are in that location, and just all of the implications of really not thinking about who that is in the first place. So we haven't really seen aggressive policy, but what we have seen is even February, we've seen legislators put in acts or bills into place, or proposing them, I should say. The DEPICT Act is one that just came out in February, where we're having legislators really say, okay, sponsors, you need to be making sure you're proactively providing that guidance, and kind of giving the FDA a little more teeth to require that a little more proactively. And I think we'll continue to see that. Yeah. So from a sponsor's perspective, more information around that guidance is good. But I think also what we're doing, I can speak to a couple of the companies I've worked with, is there is that proactive planning around a couple of strategies that we can just start embedding now, so that when it gets to that point of those requirements from the FDA, we're poised, we're ready, and we can actually meet those requirements for our patients.
Absolutely. And I think the take home message there is really, really great. And it's good. It's coming, guys. It's really coming. So just, embrace it, right? And start thinking about, a diversity strategy or strategic plan, so that the wave doesn't kind of overwhelm you, but that you'd be riding the wave. So we wanted to kind of raise that quickly as we go to the next slide, please.
Yes, awesome. I always say more than initiative, a strategy.
A strategy, an absolute strategy. So we kind of alluded to, some of the elements in terms of the bottom line here financially. And now let's roll up everything that we talked about. And we're just going to go down this list, right? A lack of diversity in clinical trials can result in, LaShell just said it, right? Not the poll yet, Kenan, not the poll yet. Kenan, yeah, not the poll yet. But here, additional required clinical studies, right, to validate a label claim or to be inclusive, right, of a particular demographic. And then we already talked about, their fees, right, to submit to the FDA, your IND, your NDA, and to get market clearance, and then to be halted like that company that LaShell just mentioned. If you look them up on Google, you can find out what company it is. We won't name them here. But exorbitant costs, and these are not small fees. You're talking in the millions. Extended clinical trial timelines. LaShell, talk about this, the lost opportunity. This is really key. Kenan, you'll love this, and some of us on this call, a lot of us will love hearing this, right? The lost opportunities and benefits with payers, right? Insurance companies. LaShell, just hop all over that.
Yeah, I mean, in particular, when we're looking at certain implications like Medicaid and Medicare, quite frankly, let's just jump right in. Looking at the clinical trial data, and if it doesn't match their population that they're serving, it's not on the list. So now you've lost a whole payer that no longer lists your medication because you do not have data that substantiates it will actually benefit their patients. And when we're looking at things like Medicaid and Medicare, there's certain metrics they have to hit, right? So it becomes a larger implication when you're now excluded because of your lack of clinical trial data. And I think for me, when I confirmed that, it was something that I always thought, but when I actually heard that from somebody, I mean, it just really, really hit home that this is the reason why we need to absolutely make sure we're always keeping the patient in mind. If we always keep the patient in mind, we won't have these issues.
That's right.
But of course, you have costly drug recalls resulting from real world population. I just mentioned that whole aspect around the clinical trial data on FDA Snapshots. Those are approved drugs. So what happens when it's in the real world? And just speaking to the public around mistrust, I always ask a person, raise your hand if you're taking a medication or if you know somebody that has a medication. Well, imagine you're not included. Well, now that you are taking the medication, you're essentially in a clinical trial, because at that point, what if something happens?
Being tested.
What if you knew before that it didn't work for you? So
right.
all of those things really roll up together when we're talking about the bottom line, when we're talking about the reason for doing it. Again, a nice fuzzy subjective reason, but at the end of the day, that objective data aspect, real world data that hits the bottom line, that hits patients, and really, really almost shakes you to your core when you think about why we need to do this for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, and let me throw this in quickly, and Ken and I know we're coming to our time. Some stats on the cost of a drug recall, right? One company, we won't name them, it cost them $6 billion, right? That includes business disruption, that includes litigation, lawsuits, legal expenses, reputation damage. Another company cost them $260 million. Take this poll: a lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials can result in. You can answer the question. In 2019 alone, there were 2,163 recalls, product recalls in pharmaceuticals alone, right? So just kind of think about all of the costs. The business disruption is 49% of those costs, and then 35% of the cost is associated with the actual recall itself. Then you have to rehabilitate the product and things like that. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is really key. That's poll question number. Perfect, beautiful, awesome. Awesome, awesome, awesome. It's all the above. It's absolutely all the above. You guys rock. Okay, so in terms of measuring your performance, next slide, Kenan, in terms of measuring your performance and some KPIs that you can take along with you, and this is our last slide, right? We want to think about ways, ways we can target and some metrics that we can put in place. And maybe LaShell, if you want to hit maybe one of them, and then we open up for questions. And then we'll also make sure that folks have access to this as well. Maybe hit one of them for 1 minute, and then Kenan, we can open it for questions, and then we close out.
Talking about KPIs metrics, having a trial metric at the very, very beginning that's actually based on the epidemiology data. One of the approaches is also looking at US Census, but I always default to going with the disease epidemiology to define what that trial metric is. It can even tell you where you need to have your trial from a global and country perspective. Screen failure rates. So yes, your trial is ongoing and maybe you didn't hit your diversity demographics, but take that as a learning opportunity. Look at those screening rates and see where are you losing your patients. It could be an upper age limit where you cut it off at 65. And is there really a rationale to have it at 65? Could you have extended it? Are there certain populations like the Latinx population that are getting excluded from this particular indicator? And then you can use that to refine. Why is that good? You reduce protocol amendments for future trials, and you can also speak again to the data and efficacy. I think the other part is trial delays due to lack of diversity. So start with those KPIs of what you think that measurement timeline is. Again, very, very milestone driven. First patient in is what we're aiming to. How much time did you shave off? The trials that I have been fortunate to participate in, when we've really planned from diversity from the very beginning, we were actually able to shave off time because we widened that exclusion and thought about diversity. And then percentage of eligible patients excluded due to lack of technology. That's self-explanatory right there. So I think these are just some of the different aspects and KPIs that you can put into place. Looking at your number of diverse investigators, where you're placing your sites, are they in diverse locations? Those are other community aspects that you can also incorporate in your KPIs that will start driving that performance. And I know there was a question in particular about strategies and senior leadership. Just wanted to hone in on that because we talked about the business rationale. And so when I'm speaking to leaders and senior leadership, that's one of those areas we lean in on are the labeling implications, some of the more costly trial perspectives. And when they start seeing those trials linger on, because now we have a post-marketing commitment, it becomes a very, very real thing that we need to start investing. And we've seen senior leadership step up. Several others across the organization have now directors of diversity in clinical trials because they realize the value of putting that strategy in place and somebody that can move forward with that execution.
Beautiful. Awesome. Thank you, LaShell. Huge applause. And that's it for today, folks. Back to you, Kenan.
Thank you so much, LaShell and Marcia. Wow, that was just a lot of great information. You could see from the chat. You guys, this is Marcia and LaShell's contact information. If you have any questions for RGP, partner at rgphealthcare.com. We can even get the questions to LaShell and Marcia also if you have questions. Again, thank you very much, you two. Thank you all the rest of you for participating, and we are so glad you're here and appreciate you with your feedback. Have a great day, everyone.
Take care. Thanks a bunch. Bye-bye.